Welcome to the Catholic Economics Podcast. I'm your host, Levi Russell, and today is June 29th, 2020. In today's episode, I want to talk about an article published in the National Catholic Register entitled A Catholic Case for Capitalism. I'm going to go through the article and just kind of give some comments on some of the main points that are made and basically use this as a foil to discuss some of the main problems we have with the economic discussion within Catholicism and the ignorance of a lot of the papal encyclicals. So if you want to support the show, the best way to do that is to share the show with your friends. I'm on YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. If you want to financially support the show, listen on your favorite podcast app instead of on YouTube, because I have an ad that runs for the podcast side. You can also choose to directly support through the support button on your podcast app or on anchor.fm/Catholic Economics. I want to make an announcement that tomorrow, and I know this is short notice, but I just found out about this yesterday. Tomorrow, June 30th, 2020, at 9 p.m. Eastern, I will be on the Settlers Lament YouTube channel. We're going to be doing about a 2-hour-long live stream and talking about Catholic economics. It's mainly going to be me kind of going through economic stuff, and then Settlers Lament and Charlemagne both kind of responding and asking questions and stuff like that. So if you're keen on that kind of thing, again, 9 p.m. Eastern, Tuesday, June 30th, 2020. Okay, so let's get into this article, which I will, of course, post in the show notes, the link to that so you can read it. It's a fairly short read. I think it's about a 5-minute read. And it's interesting that this is coming out when it is, and it seems like this is going to be a series for this particular writer, Vincent Weaver, because he sort of alludes to that at the end. But this is coming out at a time when, of course, there's much more interest in some kind of sort of third way economic policy from the likes of course, Tucker Carlson, and at the same time, in the Catholic world, we're getting pushed by the sort of left Catholic types, the socialist types, to adopt the sort of Antifa left-wing worldview on economics. And at the same time, we're being pushed by some of the sort of larger organizations within the Catholic world. For instance, Catholic Answers just published a book by Trent Horn and Catherine Pakaluk, who's an economist at CUA. Just published a book basically decrying socialism from a Catholic perspective, and I've done a review on that. I've talked. I think I've done 2 or 3 episodes on Trent's book, and so you can find those in the archives, and I'll probably link to a few of them. And I also have an actual written book review coming out very soon. I'm hoping. In the Imaginative Conservative blog. So be looking for that. And I'll, if you want to, you can follow me on Twitter at Catholic Econ. I'll be tweeting that out as soon as it's published. So today, this piece by Vincent Weaver is interesting in that it kind of coalesces a lot of the problems with the the sort of pro-capitalist Catholic position. And it starts off really with, a problem that we get from both camps, which is this idea of sort of, this economic dichotomy, right? There's a spectrum, and on either end of that spectrum is, one is socialism and the other one is capitalism. And, these are your options, and you can have, of course you can slide your little slider from the the capitalist end over to the socialist end by, adding some, government support or something like that. Or you can do the opposite. You can go from the socialist end and move it towards the capitalist end, implementing some kind of property rights or something like that. But those are the two options, right? There is no third pole in that. There's not a there's not something else on a different axis, right? It's just these left and right. That's it. Socialist, capitalist. There's no third position that that sort of operates away from this spectrum. And so he starts out by kind of giving you that perspective, and it's interesting where he talks about Christ and his. Some people argue that Christ was a socialist based on these scriptures, and then some people argue that Christ was in favor of private property and capitalism, because of course private property is capitalism, right? I mean, those are the same thing. Obviously not, but it's interesting that he kind of feeds into this narrative that, well, some people argue he was a socialist, some people argue he was capitalist. Well, of course, at the time of Christ, neither of those categories made any sense, and and it could be that, of course, that that all of this sort of to the extent that Christ articulated anything, specifically about economic policy, right? But that all of these perspectives could actually coexist, could make sense cohesively, right? The author, Vincent Weaver, doesn't even consider that, right? He specifically says the opening line: the Catholic Church has straddled the economic fence since its founding in AD 33. I mean, this is just ridiculous. If the thing is, if you think that, then you probably should be considering that your entire worldview on the subject is just wrong. Maybe you're looking at it through the wrong frame. Okay, so later on he goes into a discussion. So he says something like, for most of Christian history, and I'm reading here from the article, for most of Christian history, there have been few means of protecting the little guy from oppression by ruthless tyrants in government or unwarranted exploitation by tycoons of industry. And to me, this is just such an anachronism. For most of Christian history, we haven't been able to protect the little guy from oppression by government or tycoons of industry. Well, first of all, industry is a fairly new term in the scope of the entirety of Christian history, right? So it's silly, right? It's again, this idea is if you're locked into this socialism, capitalism axis, then you're not going to be able to read history very well, right? You're not going to understand feudalism, for instance, which, was a huge part of Christian history. And, this whole idea of there being, protecting the little guy from oppression, it doesn't even really make sense in the feudal system, right? So like, if you have a liberal worldview and you bring it to this, to bring it to your reading of feudalism, then of course you're going to say, oh, this is, exploitation and oppression by ruthless tyrants. But so the problem isn't, feudalism as a system necessarily. Maybe it's bad, maybe it's not. But the point is, the reason you see it as no different from, robber barons or, an overly powerful government is because your liberal framing does not allow you to see a third position, right? It doesn't allow you to move outside of that left-right scale of socialism, capitalism, that axis. So you have to move beyond that to have a more coherent understanding of what feudalism is, right? So, even if we take this seriously and we forget about the first part of that sentence and say, okay, forget about for most of Christian history, right? If we're just going to talk about, there's been few means of protecting the little guy from oppression by ruthless tyrants in government or unwarranted exploitation by tycoons of industry. Well, the funny thing is that when the world started to become industrialized, the popes had a lot to say. Not that they didn't before. Of course they did. They had a ton to say about, important issues like usury and the just price and very important issues like this. But all of that coalesces into what we now call Catholic social teaching, coalesces into what we call, Catholic social teaching in the 1800s, precisely when we start to see, this industrialization and this sort of, this concept that there being a little guy, right? The laborer in the factory, right? Who doesn't own anything, right? The feudalism is totally different on all of that. So the popes did address this issue, right? Pope Leo the 13th did address this issue and actually had specific policy reforms. And maybe they're not, maybe it wasn't all worked out. Sure. Part of that is, that work is for the wisdom of the statecraft in your location to handle. But the principles themselves were certainly explicitly written down in the genesis of Catholic social teaching. And so I don't understand, it's you just have to be ignoring it or misinterpreting it for you to say that there wasn't any kind of suggestion, or even recently, right? So then he goes into this discussion of, certainly, the government is right to do some things, but, here's this line from Centesimus Annus, where JP2 basically says that, the current welfare state has problems, right? So it's this kind of weird thing where, and you get this if you read Trent Horn's book too. You get this sense that there is there's always this sort of, I don't know, like it's true that, the government has some kind of role, but here's all the problems with the people who actually think that the government has some kind of role, right? So it's this kind of paying lip service to the idea that there should be, some kind of, economic policy in place to help people or to ensure the universal destination of goods, right? And then most of the work being done in the writing is to push back against, what they see as, sort of problematic uses of that policy. And so, at one point in this article, he says, the state is a means to an end, right? It's not the end in itself. Well, of course, no one is suggesting that, right? Except, perhaps the crazy socialists, who, and of course they wouldn't admit it, right? They would have some kind of weird rhetorical, gymnastics to try to get around it, some silly Mott and Bailey nonsense, to get around it. But they might see the state as an end. I don't know. But the rest of us don't see it that way. It is a means to an end, but the state has legitimate authority. Scripture says that very plainly, right? Again, despite all of the gymnastics by, a lot of capitalists to try to get around that fact, it's quite obvious that there is, that the state does have authority. And church teaching is very clear on this as well. The encyclicals talk about the fact that the Catholic social teaching encyclicals, right? They talk about the fact that the government has a vested interest in ensuring that certain policy goals are met for the public, right? Just wages and curtailing of usury and things like this. Those things have to be done. So of course the state is a means, but it is a legitimate means that should be used when it is called for. And I think this is one of the big problems is that, you will always get the the capitalist folks talking about subsidiarity as if it's this permission to simply ignore most of the policy recommendations and requirements in the social encyclicals. And simply by saying, well, if the higher authority has, should not, involve itself in the lower authorities, what a lower authority is competent to handle. And it's like, yeah, sure, I agree with that. But the problem is, just using that as a blanket excuse to not ever, implement any kind of policy is that, of course, someone has to decide what those lower authorities are competent to handle. That part is always left out. This idea that a higher authority needs to be able to or that someone, maybe it's not necessarily higher political authority, maybe it's someone else, but the point is somehow that decision has to be made. Where are the lines, and when do those lines become less important? Right? It's very simple. It's simple in the sense that it's an obvious part of the framework, right? Subsidiarity can't just exist in a vacuum. There has to be some kind of coordination and understanding on where these things, where the lines are drawn and who is competent to handle these things. So that needs to be a bigger part of the discussion, I think. So the last thing I want to talk about is the specific, the current welfare state disincentivizes work is essentially what Vincent Weaver talks about, and he's citing Centesimus Annus by Pope St. John Paul II. And so sure, yeah, I think it's demonstrable. There was a great NBER paper that showed that extending unemployment benefits in North Carolina was a tragedy in terms of getting people to work. I think in this most recent COVID-19 stuff, you've seen, I've seen a couple of news stories even in the left-wing press about this woman gets she has a small business, she gets a loan, this grant program from the government so she can continue operating and paying her employees, and all of her employees are just livid and angry with her because they wanted to be fired or laid off so that they could be put on unemployment because the unemployment benefits were more generous. And it's like, okay, well, there's a few things you can do with that. You can say, well, maybe there's a just wage issue. But you can also just say that, well, obviously whoever designed the COVID-19 unemployment benefits, was sort of dealing with a very strange model of, of human trade-offs, right? How we make trade-offs. So, that is certainly true. But the point is, and I think the author here, Vincent Weaver, falls into this trap of just talking about more versus less government, right? Sometimes that's a useful way of talking about things, but in this case, it's not, right? So just saying, oh, well, some people, even though, JP2 said that, the current welfare state disincentivizes work, some people want the government to do more. How silly is that? Yeah, well, okay. If again, all you're thinking about is some kind of abstract concept of quantity of government intervention, then of course it's going to make no sense. But the problem is that there are sort of qualitative dimensions that are very important for understanding how the government actually implements these things. So it's not just that, the government either does or does not attempt some kind of helpful, program in the economic sphere. It's that, some of these interventions are wise and some of them aren't. And so, addressing the issue of, just wages and family wages is probably very important and probably a wise thing for the government to do, right? I mean, if we just lean on, the entirety of the corpus of Catholic social teaching, then we understand this. But if we're locked in this sort of liberal paradigm on, the quantity of government intervention, whatever that means, then we're not going to understand very well what the right solutions are to, the problems that we face. So so that's just my take on this article. And again, I'm going to post it for you, and I hope you'll, anyway, I hope there's something helpful that can come out of this article. If anything other than just to be sort of a foil for understanding, the problems, that we're facing. So thanks for joining me today, and I appreciate all of you listening, and hopefully, as I'm changing the format here, hopefully I'll get things kind of more crisp, and hopefully we'll be able to grow the show and do some more education on Catholic economics. So thanks for joining me.